So 105 journalists were killed this year. Most of them were local journalists, most of them killed in conflict rather than in peacetime. Historically, yes, local journalists do suffer the most losses. It's nearly always more local journalists killed than international journalists. The most dangerous country for journalists, wherever they came from last year, was Syria. And some of the incidents were incredibly high profile. So for instance, the beheading of Stephen Sotloff and Jim Foley, they were very, very high profile. So the international journalists who were killed, we became more aware of them. It's always the case, as I say, that more local journalists are killed than international journalists, but where we see stories of high conflict, so for instance in Gaza, in Ukraine, or in Syria last year, where international journalists parachute in and hopefully parachute out, many more have been killed in those instances. Syria has been the most dangerous country for journalists wherever they come from, but particularly local journalists in the last 3 years. It's become so difficult that many news organisations are trying to overhaul how they're covering it. They're relying very heavily on local journalists, but there are so few local journalists out in Syria nowadays, and the threats that those so few face are so great that there's a huge kind of work going into overhauling the coverage and trying to make it more secure for everybody. We know that impunity is rife. We know that impunity, in about 90% of cases, the killers of journalists are never brought to justice. That's across the whole world, from Mexico, Philippines, Pakistan. But we also know that a lot of the journalists, between 30 and 40%, some say, who are killed, are threatened beforehand. And that means that perhaps we can do something about that. At INTSE, we're trying to work with some of those journalists to try and ensure they understand the risks they face and try and find ways around those risks to perhaps change their routines. We started January 2015, and the situation for a few days was kind of the same as it had been in 2014, lots of threats from Syria, from Iraq, threats of detention, threats of kidnapping. And then we had the incidents in Paris with the killings of the journalist at Charlie Hebdo, and that threw things completely up in the air. It was a real game changer, if you like. It was a huge number of journalists killed. It was journalists killed in Europe. It was journalists killed not in a war zone. And that for us has really set the ball rolling in terms of how journalists and organisations need to look at safety and work together to try and find a safer place, whether it be in the field, whether it be in war zones, or whether it be in the office for journalists to work.